We are live.
This is Literary Roadhouse. One short story, once a week. I'm Anais.
I'm Remy.
I'm Gerald.
And I'm Maya. And before we get started, I want to announce the Literary Roadhouse's new podcast. The first episode is going to come out on the 4th of January. It's the Bradbury Challenge, where me, Gerald, and newcomer Chrissy Moss are all going to be writing a short story every single week for the year 2016. And we'll be talking about that challenge.
But if you want to keep reading, join us the first Friday of every month, starting January 1st, to discuss full-length novels on our new show, the Literary Roadhouse Book Club. Our first book to be discussed in January is The Heart Goes Last by Margaret Atwood.
And just in case we get a little bit excited in our discussions today, we try and keep the language quite clean, but if we go a little bit over the top, the rankings and the ratings on the podcast show notes.
Okay, so last week we described the first prize in Carve Magazine's Raymond Carver competition, Arrangements by Charles Watts. This week we're discussing the second place winner, Kudzu by Andrea Bobotis. If you haven't read it and don't want to be spoiled, pause the podcast, read the story, then come back. So the story takes place in the foothills of South Carolina, where Kudzu vine invades and takes over everything in its path. Millicent Dodge, an older woman with a grown son, receives an unexpected guest named Teddy. Teddy says he is traveling across the country, has been for some time, and needs a place to stay for the night. He agrees to do house chores in exchange for a bed. Teddy is about the same age as Arlen, Millicent's gambling, thieving son. Both men are in their 30s. Teddy stays for several months, and Arlen, who visits infrequently and only resides in the house when things go badly for him, advises Millicent to get rid of Teddy. But she doesn't evict Teddy, whom she has grown fond of. Eventually, Arlen pays Teddy to leave. He does, and Millicent knows she must live with Arlen.
Okay, so let's start at the top level. How did we all feel about this story?
Yeah. Okay, that's me. That's my top
I
level.
would like to echo Gerald's sentiments.
So will I. I am also echoing Gerald and Rami's sentiments.
And I love the story.
Okay, great.
Okay.
I really love the story. That is too funny.
It's like the inverse of last week.
Exactly, exact inverse of last week. There was something about the language in the story. There was something about the ambiguity of the story that I really enjoyed. I loved my confusion and multiple interpretations at the end. So yeah, I really, really like this story.
Yeah, I had problems with it. I think it sort of went nowhere for me. I don't. It's really hard to describe, and why I didn't sort of fall in love with the story. It seemed to be sort of meandering. I didn't really know what was going on, who the guy was, why he was there, how he came to be there, and it just sort of didn't fit for me.
Mm-hmm. How about for you, Remy? What was it about it that kind of just didn't click for you?
I guess it wasn't. It didn't really arouse any particular emotions, or wasn't moving. I felt some of the phrases were a little awkwardly worded, or the descriptions and stuff. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Anais?
Yeah, I would agree with Rami. I felt like I wasn't really moved by it. Nothing really gripped me. Characters, for me, just sort of didn't really care about any of them. And when I say it didn't really move me, it's like even Arlen, who had the potential to be, you know how like when there's a character that's so bad that you hate them, but you enjoy the process of hating them because it's not a real character affecting your life. Didn't even have that with Arlen, so it was just kind of yeah.
Yeah, I would say some of the reasons why I liked it are probably related to the reasons why you guys didn't like it. It was a really subtle story. There was nothing that was banging me over the head. There were no big emotions, big, huge events. The ending was very ambiguous. I sat for a few minutes trying to figure out what exactly happened. But those are traits that I liked in it. so it didn't bother me, but it was definitely written in a much more distant literary telling style rather than a showing style that you frequently see with modern short stories. It was very much then this happened and then this happened. It was a distant story. It was the point of view was removed. It wasn't as close as I think we're more used to seeing, but there was something in the story I really liked, and I wonder if it's related to the fact that I'm a mom. Because I connected with it on a really deep level, and I'm not sure if I think part of it might be because I related to the character as a mother.
Okay. I thought when it started, I was quite enjoying it because I thought there was a lot of subtle tension being brought into it, and the choice of words was really good, and you knew what the status of the two people was, but then I thought it's just sort of went a bit sort of so, and then this happened, and then that happened, and then he got paid off, and then he went, and I just never really got anywhere for me.
Yeah, I would say I fell in love with the story within the first paragraph. But it wasn't like one of those stories where I read it and then I was like, oh my God, I'm all in. It was like, ooh, it piqued my interest. And it kind of seduced me more slowly. In particular, there was the one phrase that really just made me trust the author and just go with it. And it was, when he came into focus, he was a jumble of limbs advancing down the pale country road, a man on a boy's bike. That particular phrase was so visual for me that it made me trust the author and give her a little bit more time to get more into the story, whereas I can see how if I hadn't been caught so early, I might have been bored, by midway.
That's interesting because for me, the opening of the story had me do a double take because for a second I thought I was reading arrangements again.
Really?
Yeah, and then I had to check the link to see if I clicked the because
that's really
you know how
funny.
it starts describing the two, but then I remembered that the other one described the man as a piñata. So
That is really, really funny.
It's funny, Maya, that you mentioned that the motherhood thing is what drew you in, because that was probably the most fascinating part of the story, was the paragraph that starts with motherhood for Millicent, and it talks about how, she was kind of disappointed by motherhood, and she felt like it was an invasion of her, an erosion of who she was, and she felt too tethered to the child, and, he never gets cut off, right? That part was probably the most colorful part for me, and there was even a point where I wondered, it almost felt, obviously I have no way of knowing this, but it almost, made me imagine, that the author had this, motherhood epiphany and then was like, I need to get this idea out there, and then built a story around it. It was almost kind of how it felt. But if you had given me just that paragraph, it would have been, great. That's kind of how I felt.
I felt like this story touched on a part of motherhood that a lot of women don't necessarily talk about, because it's kind of like if you talk about it openly, you're kind of judged for it. It's the whole, they hand you a new baby and they expect you to bond with it instantly because we're birds, but we're not. And for some women, it takes months before we bond with that baby. And so, and for some women, it never, you always have that feeling of, I'm no longer myself, I'm owned by something else. Mm-hmm. It just happens to be your child. And to see that in a story, and it wasn't done in a judging way, it was just, this was her reality, and to see that expressed, how that affected her long term, her in her old age, and she still feels that tether, was really strong and impactful for me. As a mom, I really felt for this woman, and I think about my own mom who didn't have an empty nest until her 70s because her adult children kept losing houses, losing jobs, breaking up with wives. They just never freaking left. And so I read the story probably from a little bit different perspective.
Mm.
Yeah, and I was going to say also towards the end, the other moment where I sort of perked up, only to be disappointed, was when Teddy leads her out into the big kudzu field. I'm like, is he going to abandon her? And I got really excited like a crazy person. And then he didn't.
I think he did.
He
brought her out there, but he's not bringing her back. Just the way I read it, the last line, that there can only be two in that house, and he's taken her all the way out there with no water, and it's hot, and he's been paid off. To me, that said that there was a deal made, and it was really, really sad. And it took me a few minutes because I was like, is that really what happened? Like, maybe he's leaving. But that's not how it read to me. It really read to me like the son had paid him to help get rid of her.
That's kind of what I wanted to happen. I mean,
but it wasn't explicit. Like, it was confusing.
Yeah, because she says to him, let's go home. And he says, about that. She's like, I know, you don't have to tell me. She stretches out in the Kudzu. Arlen had paid Teddy to leave. You're right that it doesn't explicitly say they go back to the house. But
it's very subtle.
It's her choice, though, because Teddy's willing to go back to drop her off at the house, I think. At least that's my reading of it.
Yeah, I didn't read it that way. And I think how you read that ending could probably really affect how much you like the story. I think if you read the story as he takes her out there and then he takes her back to the house and leaves, that's anticlimactic. That can't be how it ends. Like, no author is going to end the story that way. Like, it breaks all of the end of story, short story twist rules, right? All those rules. So he has to have been paid off to get rid of her. And she knows that her son isn't, her son only shows up when there's a problem. And when he showed up and there was a problem, his spot was filled. And so he's got a choice. He can either get rid of mom for good, or he can be a good son.
No, I don't think he's a good son. I think he's getting rid of Teddy because he doesn't like the competition. But
yeah, I don't think he got rid of Teddy.
And it's not like she's, she could get back from where she is. She's not in the
No. She's exhausted. She's hot and exhausted and way out in the middle of the Kudzu, and she doesn't have any shoes on, and she's getting tangled up just walking.
Okay.
How did you read the ending, Rami?
I took it for what it was. I said, okay, he paid him off and he left.
You took it as Teddy left. Yeah, I did not take it as Teddy left. I wish I could get the author on here. I want to know like what she thought, because this reminds me of all those French films where at the end of the movie you're just like, what happened? I don't understand this ending.
I think Gerald's rereading it. He's got reader eyes on.
Yeah, he's trying. He's like, no, what really did happen? Because now I'm wondering, did I read this right? Yeah, he's got that expression.
So Gerald, upon rereading, how did it end for you?
Still the same.
I think she went home.
Because Teddy comes back to her and because she calls for him, and then he comes back and he says, Millicent, are you taking a nap? And she says, let's go home. And yeah, maybe. I think if it is, and I can see how Maya would think that it was that ending that she's left out there, which seems to make more sense. But I think
like Annie said, on some level she's given up. She just lays back and closes her eyes. She's given up.
It's a bit like that. I can't remember what it's called. That other one where the guy just sort of wanders around in the snow, and he.
Jack London. No. Steer. Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah, I like the fact that it was ambiguous, but it was really ambiguous. Like, I sat there for probably a good 5 to 10 minutes trying to decide what I thought happened at the ending.
Well,
but I immediately thought that she died. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think because I'd sort of lost interest by that stage. So,
so Gerald, tell us how you really felt.
Horrible thing to say, I know, but because the opening was so strong and such lovely writing and such beautiful imagery and then it was this happened, then that happened, and then I sort of got to the end and I thought that's weird, and then I reread it and sort of just thought, yeah, that's weird.
Gerald, can you do you know what it was that made you lose interest? Like, where in the story it was?
I think when he was because there didn't seem to be much real interaction between Teddy and Millicent, in that he did stuff and then she did stuff, and there was no. I think I'd have liked to see sort of more of the characters.
Mm-hmm.
to sort of to draw me in. I think it drew me in at the start and then let me wander off.
Yeah. What did you guys think about the symbolism of the Kudzu?
I feel like it was symbolizing maybe Teddy or Arlen as well, because when they described it, what did they say? Oh, it's now coiling its way into town, encountering little protest along the way, so kind of like creeping in and just like making itself at home despite, any effort to stop it or anything.
Yeah, it's definitely an invasive species, and for me, it symbolized two things. It symbolized her relationship with motherhood, as the motherhood creeping in and just sucking out everything that is her, but it also symbolized Teddy, and that was what finally made me decide that he actually left her, because what does Kudzu do? It invades, and it chokes out all the good plants, and so it replaced her. And so I felt like that was a really good use of symbolism, and that's something that is like definitely a weak point in my own writing, and it really like piqued my interest, like how she used that as a really telling part of the story.
I think for me, Kudzu is more Arlen because it uses uses some of the same language as her paragraph on motherhood. So it kind of rounds out the edges of things. Like if Kudzu grows over a barn, you kind of can tell it's a barn, but it's like softer. It invades things. It never lets go. It's clingy. So it felt to me like it was more like Arlen. And even if you read it with your more interesting ending, it's really Arlen who pushes her out of the house, because he's the one who makes the decision to pay. Even though I don't think she was forced out of the house still, I can't read the ending that way, but either with your ending version or with my ending version, it still is Arlen who's, who's invading her life. Because Teddy, she has a choice. She tells him he can come in, and she seems to like his presence. He's more like the Black-Eyed Susans.
Yeah. For a while I wondered if he was even real. I was like, is this like the angel of death? No, really. I read On a Pale Horse as a teenager.
If it was, they wouldn't have called the angel of death Teddy.
Coming in and seducing her to come to the other side.
But his name wouldn't have been Teddy.
You can't distrust somebody named Teddy. Like, if you're gonna sneak into someone's life and kill them, what better name for yourself?
Yeah,
you can't have like a name like Lucifer or Damien. It's gotta be something innocuous like Nick, Ben, Teddy.
I didn't like the name. I don't like the name Millicent. It reminds me of Maleficent.
Maleficent. I had the same thought. That's right? Funny. It does sound like a Wicked Witch name.
Yeah.
Also, I pictured Teddy as some sort of ethnic minority, because when she's like, where are you originally from? That question is always directed.
Yeah, it's that question.
It's that question. I know that question.
My daughter gets that question a lot. We know that question well.
Yeah.
Me too.
And Gerald remains awkwardly silent. That's okay, Gerald. You're our token Caucasian.
I'm an ethnic minority here, aren't I?
Where are you originally from, Gerald?
The planet is dog.
Yeah, it seems like, this story, it really impacted me, but as I'm thinking about it, it doesn't seem like some of the stories we read have tons and tons and tons of layers, and we can just sit and talk about it for hours. This story has fewer layers to me. It doesn't really lend itself to deeper reading to me, except for the crazy ending. It seems like a really straightforward story. How about for you guys?
Yeah,
the ending to me wasn't that crazy.
That's just because you weren't as enlightened.
Yeah. Probably.
Because I'm a genius and all, but
I think it was really well written. I think it's a well written story, lovely use of language, lovely use of imagery. But yeah, it sort of left me flat, and I think the reading of the ending or the misreading of the ending really sort of maybe just think, "Ugh, really?"
Yeah. I love the use of language in this story. I
Mm.
really, really did. Which I find interesting because, Rami, you said that the language felt clumsy to you.
Well, I said some parts. Some was good, but for example, she watched him from the window seat where she had been installed since breakfast. It just seems awkward for using installed in that situation. Or his chest was small and tight as a hazelnut. I don't know. Doesn't work for me too much. But some things were good. Like when she was describing how her chest felt like a towel was untwisting, like that one that one was good.
Yeah, I feel like the language for me, it's in like that category of writing that I think I've mentioned before in this podcast where it's extremely competent. She gets across the images and the story that she wants to get across. It reads and flows well, but I always call it the MFA feel. Like it feels a little, like it has like
Yeah,
a
it
yeah, like
definitely had that MFA feel.
yeah, like this kind of like homogenous kind of like tone almost. It's like it's got like a certain tone to it where I'm just
It's
like,
the modern literary tone.
yeah,
It's not complex in necessarily the wording, but the sentence structures tend to be tweaked a little bit in a way that just has a certain sound. I totally know what you mean. A
yeah.
lot of those stories I tend to turn off from. This one I didn't, but I totally get what you're saying.
Yeah, it doesn't turn me off, but it also doesn't make me give it like a great score for language because I feel almost like that's all like it's a lot of what I read. So it's like a competent vehicle. Like it works really well for getting the story across.
Mm.
But yeah.
Yeah, I actually liked it. There were some things about it that elevated it above that general literary modern style, but there were definitely sections that very much felt like what you would get out of workshopping a short story heavily. That's something we should talk about sometime because the difference between literary fiction right now versus literary fiction 10 years ago is pretty stark. Like, there's definitely a sound and almost a flavor in literary fiction right now that I'm seeing as we read more and more like current stuff. Um, there's definitely a feeling, and when I read something that's outside that, I get really excited now. Whereas before, I don't think I would have even noticed it.
hmm And I think also there's something about this tone that doesn't let the emotional dial for me as a reader jump as much, but I like when the emotional dial jumps. So this kind of has me flatlining a little bit. It's something about this style where it's just like, especially
Mm-hmm.
like I feel like if she would have drawn out the relationship between Millicent and Teddy as a point of comparison against how she feels about Arlen, you could have had that emotional dial start moving more.
Mm.
But it's almost like literary and intelligent. This is like tales of the time for the centuries. There seems to be this like idea that's like the less emotional you are, the more rational you are, the more cold you are, the more intelligent you are. And I feel like this kind of MFA style has a little bit of that. And I'm probably being spoiled right now because I'm reading Elena Ferranti, which is very Italian in the sense that the emotional dial is like this without
Mm-hmm.
losing any of its intelligence. So I guess
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, I totally get what you're saying because, like, when you reread a lot of modern genre fiction, it's very emotional, a lot of it.
hmm
But the current literary fiction tends to be more cerebral. Sometimes I like that, sometimes I don't, but I totally get what you're saying. And I think you can even hear that emotional flatlining in our conversation about the story. Like, the story doesn't lend itself to dynamic conversation the way some of our other stories have.
hmm
Here we are, what, 24 minutes in, and I'm already feeling like we're ready to rate it. That never happens on this
hmm
podcast. And then it's because there wasn't anything in particular there weren't enough layers for us to really have an argument about it. Um, the things I liked about it are the same things you guys don't like about it, and the emotional tenor of the story doesn't really go up and down. Wow, this is going to be one of those podcasts where my scoring may actually drop after talking to you guys. Thanks a lot.
Come
Yeah,
down into the quicksand.
I think it's
I
quite
am.
interesting. It's interesting you talk about the styles of short story writing over time, and I suddenly sort of realised that this is that the stories that when I first started reading literary short fiction, I liked the punchy staccato, really punch you in the face sentences and as Anais says, the emotional drag you this way, drag you that way, and this is more of a subtle story, and it's just doesn't feel the same. It's just a story.
Yeah. I'm actually having that problem with the stuff I'm submitting because it's literary fiction, but it tends to be really emotional, and it has a lot more of the peaks and valleys that you're talking about, which is not the current style. So it's like, okay, where do I send this? This isn't the current style. This isn't what people are reading right now as far as quote-unquote literary fiction. And so it is kind of frustrating. And older stories, like when we read stories from the early 19th century, like the first story we read, the woman with the husband that died, like freaking emotional all over the place.
Yeah, and it was like creepy. It was like creepy emotion, and then like her husband just died, and she feels free, and it's like, oh my god, like it was great.
And I find it interesting that you said that the Italian writer you're reading has a lot of that, and I think that's why Latin fiction and Japanese fiction is so popular right now, is because American literary fiction has gotten very cerebral. But the Latin fiction and the Japanese fiction is still really emotional. And I think that might be why so many young people that are into reading literary fiction are gravitating towards magical realism, the Latin authors, the Japanese authors. I wonder if that has a part in it.
Yeah. And also the thing about...
Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say that this Italian author, just real quick, not only is she emotional, but despite, it's not just like, she doesn't just rely on the emotion to carry her through, and it has tons of layers, and the unreliable narrator is great. Anyway, Elena Ferrante, everybody read her.
But that's a good point. I don't think it should be one or the other. Exactly. I like fiction that is emotional, but also has layers and has nuance. I don't want everything spelled out for me, which drives me crazy, because a lot of people want everything spelled out for them. Like if you workshop something, they're like, what is this? Where's this going? And they're like a paragraph in. I'm like, read 2 more paragraphs and it'll tell you. Like, freaking be patient here. What author said a good story doesn't give away all its secrets up front? I can't remember. It might have been Hemingway, but probably not. It was probably Kurt Vonnegut or something. But I see a lot of that, and I think it's really interesting how those trends have changed and whether or not it's going to trend back.
Maya, you don't strike me as a person who would adhere to the status quo. So just because it happens to be the trend, like you say, you can still do your own thing.
But the problem is, if you're talking about literary fiction, especially short fiction, it's very competitive to be published. And if the current style is what people are publishing and your work doesn't fit in the current style, good luck getting it published. And as a literary writer, you don't necessarily have as open a playing field to be successful as a self-pub author. And so it is a big deal. If everybody's publishing the same types of stories, then that's kind of a problem for anybody that's writing outside the box. Gerald knows what I'm talking about. You know, there's a certain tone that is in vogue right now. And exactly. So the question is, when is it going to turn? And does it turn in your direction? And are you going to be frustrated, or are you still going to be writing when it finally turns?
I suppose it depends whether you got to write for the market or write for you.
Yeah, I know at least one author who actually was a guest. I'm not going to say his name, but you know who I'm talking about, who actually stopped writing. Like, he had 3 published books, and he finally stopped writing. And I know people on Scribophile that are writing literary works that are trying to get published, and it's constantly this: are you going to write to get your crits in, to get your tear sheets, or are you going to stay going and just be unsuccessful and not pay bills? I don't know. I am looking at these stories, some of the modern stories, and this one in particular I liked, but it does worry me. You know, for next year, for the Bribery Challenge, my goal is going to be to get 2 stories placed somewhere. And it's like, I don't know if I can, because I don't think I could write this story. It's very subtle, it's very slow, it's plotting, I can enjoy it, but I don't think I could write this story.
And you keep saying it's subtle, but that comment I made earlier about how the motherhood from Millicent paragraph seems to be the point and a story was constructed around it, it's a little bit because aside from the Kudzu, either I missed it or it doesn't feel like a story that has its theme woven through every interaction. Like, you know how there's some stories where you're like, here's the theme again, here it is again. This one didn't really have that.
Yeah, I can see where you're saying that. The Kudzu definitely reappeared.
Right. The Kudzu.
But yeah, I think that's part of the reason why it doesn't feel as deep of a story. Because it isn't woven in, and there doesn't seem to be multiple layers of. It has a point, and that is the point.
And I think, and also Millicent seems to be just almost like a foil character. She's she doesn't want him in, but she lets him in, and she gives him work, and she makes him breakfast every morning, and I just think do something, say something. It's like
it's the replacement son, but she's not very active. Well, that is interesting because a lot of people are like that. They're passive people. So
but I don't know,
when you write a passive person, how do you make that story interesting if your main character is a passive person?
Don't write
Back
about
to Elena
passive.
Ferrante. No, really.
You just get on these tears, man. You just get on these tears.
Well, it's funny Gerald said that because one of my notes that I'm reading right now is another protagonist where things happen to her. Like, things happen to her. But here's the thing. The narrator in My Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferrante, she is actually the more passive one in the friendship. It's the other friend, Leela, who, like, does everything and is bold and, like, is kind of crazy. And Lenu, the narrator, she kind of just thinks sort of... Yeah, she only does as much as she needs to impress the people around her, but she has very little drive for most of the novel up until the very, very end. And yet she's fascinating. So there is a way to do it.
Yeah, I think the idea of, if you have somebody who's not very active, they need to be very sympathetic in order to counter that.
Yeah, and they have characteristics. They have a character, and they have a backstory. And somebody said to me a long time ago, he said, everyone's got a story. And I was talking to an actor in the local pub the other night, and we're talking about how we love being in the pub and talking to people and listening to people and listening to their stories. So I think even though she's a passive character and things happen to her, she doesn't rebel against them. She doesn't fight it. She doesn't seem to bother her. It's just she's just a sponge, and she just sucks it all up and does nothing.
She's almost like an archetype.
Yeah.
So, and I was gonna say, because the POV is so distant, you don't even get an interesting internal world.
Yeah, the POV is really distant, and I was not used to that. I'm actually surprised I like the story, because usually when a POV is that distant, I'm just not all in. But there was something about the writing that I liked that just kind of drew me in slowly and allowed me to get past that. But it was I think it's probably the most distant POV we've read on the podcast. I can't remember reading a story that felt this far removed from the main character.
Anais said that she would have liked to see a stronger interaction between Millicent and her son Arlen, but for me, I mean, that could have been one idea, but I was curious to see some drama or tension build up between Teddy and him when he returned home, and I think that's sort of when the story lost me. It was like, okay, the son's home, what's going to happen? But still nothing really came out of that.
Yeah, except for the mom, getting out of the way and getting drawn into a field and left for dead. But,
if you read it that way.
That is the more interesting ending, and it makes sense with the Kudzu symbology and the twist rules of short story structure. That's the only ending that makes sense. The other one doesn't make sense.
Yeah, well, okay.
It really doesn't. Like, if you wrote it the other way, then this is a bad story.
Yeah.
You think she was left for dead? I didn't get that at all.
No.
I got that Teddy took her out there and was going to leave her, but he's kind of torn because she's been so good to him. And she calls him back, and he goes back, and he's like, I need to tell you something. And she's like, I already know. And then she closes her eyes and just lays out in the field where she's all hot and sweaty, and she can't walk because the Kudzu is swallowing her alive.
Wow.
Oh.
I mean, I wish that's how I'd read it, and even reading it, I can't read it that way because that would be way more interesting. I wanted him to.
But no, but see why I like it. Because if I'd read it the way you guys read it, I totally would have been like, well, that sucked.
Mm-hmm. Even reading it, like even with your guidance, I can't be like, I think that's what happened.
Yeah, because if that's the way the author read it, I would like probably rate it a good 2 points lower than what I'm rating it. I found the ending very intriguing, but if the ending was the other way, I feel like then about halfway through the story, she let go and just dropped the ball.
Well, okay, I will say this. I will say that if your story is this subtle and you need an ending to be like, oh, you need to be clear. You need to be really clear about what happened.
But this is a modern literary book. Everyone has to feel confused and conflicted at the ends of their stories. No, I'm joking.
We weren't confused and conflicted. We know what went on. But yeah, your ending makes the final 2 sentences make sense then, because then it's the house is fit for 2. She said she knew which 2, so it's why.
Being Teddy and Arlen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that
she's been squeezed out by the Kudzu.
See, but here's the thing. Okay, here's the reason why I can't read it that way. It's because she goes, I know, you don't have to tell me Arlen had paid Teddy to leave. So is Millicent just an unreliable narrator who's like, you don't have to tell me you're leaving Teddy, now I'm just going to die here in the Kudzu? Like, that's the part I don't understand. That's her conclusion.
That's one of the worst ideas if you want to kill someone, too. I don't, like, you just...
Oh, she's old. She won't last long out there in the heat and dehydration.
To our older listeners, I think you're very competent.
Gerald's
old here. 30-year-old children. Yes.
You're not old.
And the story said that summer was finally going, so it was turning into autumn. So it's not like midsummer and it's too hot and she's going to, die of exposure or anything. But mind you, just a quick. I went to a writers group yesterday, and one of the writers, we were talking about ages, and she said, "You're four times my age." I thought, oh,
that sucks.
Oh,
you don't want to hear that. That's
No.
like when my daughter had her birthday and I realized she was the same age that I was when I got pregnant. I was like, I'm not okay with that.
No.
And then she rubbed my nose in it for like weeks. Mom, do you know that I'm the same age you were when you got pregnant? Hey, Mom, do you know I'm the same age you were when you were a stripper? I was like, Risa, go to your room.
Yeah. You don't want to hear that stuff.
No. Spawn.
Yeah. I think it's rating time.
Yeah, I think it's rating time. So I'm going to go first because you guys are making me like the story less and it's annoying me. I originally was going to give this story a good solid 5, but I'm going to have to give it a 4 because if the ending was so ambiguous that one ending makes me love the story and the other ending makes the story completely flat, and you can't tell which one it really is, then I think that's a problem. And if 3 out of 4 people didn't read the amazing, genius, obviously well-written ending, then there's a problem with it. But I personally think the ending was genius. I think the author was great, but I think that, if you're having this much of a problem with your readership, then I can't really justify a 5.
You should rate it on how you feel about it, not how.
But that's the thing. You guys changed how I felt about it because I really liked it. But as I was talking to you guys, I was like, oh, well, if that's what the author really meant, that kind of sucks. And then I started questioning myself. And I had this when I started reading Carver before I read like 37 of his stories and finally got how he writes. But the first few stories of Carver, like at the end of the story, I would be like, what actually happened? And that usually makes me dock a point. I don't want to wonder whether or not I am a decent reader or completely illiterate. And so the fact that I'm now questioning how I read it and whether or not whether or not like I'm smart enough to have like really read the ending, or whether I'm just seeing something that isn't there. That to me makes me uncomfortable and will make me dock a point.
Okay. It's a 3 for me, I'm afraid. Sorry.
Yeah, it's a 3 for me, and only because 2.5 sounds too harsh. But I feel like in my
That
heart
was
of hearts-
really harsh.
I know. So I'm like putting it at a 3 because I'm like, it's like I said, it's like a really like competent. But yeah, it didn't move me. It's 3.
Well, I'm gonna give you a 2.5, Anais.
You're so brave, Rami.
Thank you.
Yeah, he's just like, jump right
Easy
in there, no
choice.
fear.
It is what it is.
You see, he's not a writer, so he doesn't care about writers.
Yeah, like I feel bad because it's like it's not like it's like the worst story ever, but also
No.
like can you do
Read
something
better.
now?
Okie dokie. So let's see here. What are we putting in the pot for this week's competition?
Well, I'm gonna having second thoughts now, but I'll say I'm putting forward Kindling by Raymond Carver.
I'm pulling another story from World Literature Today, The Surprise by Lily Patapara. She is, I think, from Slovenia, and it looked like an interesting story.
Rami?
Oh yeah. Oh, sorry. I forgot
Like,
that.
oh wow, the story was so boring, I forgot I was on the podcast.
No, I forgot that Anais wasn't nominated. Yeah, so I am gonna choose the story that I was gonna do last week before I decided to try to get your story nominated, Maya, but then was dismissed and accused of not having one. So it's called That's what I got, right? Year's End, Jhumpa Lahiri, and it's fitting because we're at the end of the year.
Very good. Oh,
Very
I
good.
like it.
And
Okay.
because we're at the end of the year, I have a holiday quiz. That's how moved I
Oh,
was by
great.
Kudzu. I'm just going with the
I just
holidays.
can't get away from y'all's
I hope
holidays.
it's not about kittens.
It's not about kittens, but I may come home to having a third.
I'm Scrooge.
That's not for the podcast. Okay.
I'm Buddhist, so like this whole month is like, man, we don't get like cool holidays. Our winter holiday is like sit and meditate on how Buddha reached enlightenment.
Well, hopefully you know enough about other holidays.
No presents, no lights.
Okay, so round 1. Gerald's first. And this is just, I'm only giving 2 options in the multiple choice, so 50-50. You guys got this.
Okay.
Okay.
So, who won an Oscar for playing Santa Claus? Was it Edmund Gwenn in Miracle on 34th Street or Alastair Sim in A Christmas Carol?
I think it would have been Alastair Sim.
Nope, it was Edmund Gwenn.
Hmm.
Womp womp. Maya. So what exactly is a Kringle? Like Kris Kringle. Kringle is a thing. Is it A, the Norse word for reindeer, or B, a Danish pastry?
A pastry.
Yes, a pastry. Okay. Rami. In British culture, on Boxing Day, which is the 26th of December, what do they do? Or like what is it supposed to do? I don't know if they do.
Okay.
Is it A, giving alms to the poor, or B, a community bonfire burning of gift boxes?
Poor.
The poor, yes. Round 2. Gerald. What does Kwanzaa mean? A, Swahili for fresh fruits, or B, Swahili for family?
Family.
Fresh fruits.
Really?
Okay.
Maya. What's the role of shamash at Hanukkah? Is it a ceremonial hammer or the candle to light the menorah?
Hammer.
Nope, candle.
I should know that.
Okay, Rami. What December holiday features feats of strength and airing of personal grievances among its traditions? Is it Hanukkah
Divorce?
or Hanukkah or Festivus?
Or what?
Festivus.
The second one.
It is Festivus.
I didn't even know what that is.
Isn't Festivus from one of those like countries with a lot of like big, strong blonde people?
No, Festivus for the rest of us. It's the secular holiday from, well, it was popularized by Seinfeld, but we
Oh,
have
that's
more.
funny.
Yeah. Round 3 is all Festivus questions because Festivus is on December 23rd, which is when this podcast airs. So,
Oh.
listeners, if they're listening to this, the day comes out, it's Festivus, the secular holiday for atheists. So,
Wow.
yeah. Okay, so, Gerald,
Yes.
what is the traditional Festivus feast, which is eaten during the airing of personal grievances? Is it meatloaf on lettuce or a tuna casserole in a Disney-themed bowl?
I figured the second one, the tuna casserole.
Gotta be the casserole.
No, I made that up. It's meatloaf on lettuce, which is still kind of gross.
Like, it just sounds like so like
Very
Church
good.
of the Spaghetti Monster.
Okay.
Very good one.
So, Maya, the final Festivus tradition, the feats of strength, ends when what happens? When someone bleeds or the head of household is pinned.
Someone bleeds.
Nope, head of household is pinned. Rami, you basically already won, but for funsies.
Thanks.
Instead of a tree or a menorah, what is the symbol of Festivus? What do they put up for Festivus? Is it an unadorned aluminum pole or drinking glasses stacked like a pyramid?
Drinking glasses.
Nope, it's a pole. It's just a pole with nothing on it. That's the Festivus. Also, the tiebreaker just has 2 more facts, so this is fascinating. So Festivus was actually invented in the 60s in a family, and the son grew up to be a writer for Seinfeld. That's how he got it in there. The guy's name is Daniel O'Keefe. And the Festivus pole was made up by the writers because originally O'Keefe's father, instead of a pole, he would put a clock in a clear plastic bag and nail it to the wall, which was just too bizarre.
Wow.
That's
Yeah, I agree.
awesome. That is so much awesome.
Yep.
So what are we reading next week, Rami?
Year's End by Jhumpa Lahiri.
Okay, but before you go, remember that Militant's house is built for 2, but our comment section is made for you. So head over to Literary Roadhouse and stay as long as you like, but pay your way by leaving a comment in the comment section. Other website projects include leaving a review on iTunes, Stitcher, and Spreaker, then sharing this podcast with your friends. Until next time, read a good story.